time, so we weren't here. But we're back, and we've got our guest, Erica Obi. So, now to what we're about tonight. We're a monthly show based here on the Second Life Book Club Island in Second Life. We broadcast live from here on Facebook and YouTube every third Monday of the month at 6 p.m. Second Life time, Pacific time for you folks in real life. We meet mystery authors and others from the publishing world to talk about books and the issues facing them today from a social and technological change. And there's a lot of those about lately. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Drax Dupre, host of the Second Life Book Club and of the Drax Files Radio Hour, both broadcast from Second Life, for his sponsorship and the use of Book Club Island. I'd also like to thank Strawberry Linden and Brett Linden for their help in setting this show up. And finally, my eternal thanks to Becky Hansen and Isabel Charon for all their technical assistance in making this happen. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. And special thanks to Isabel for getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning her time to run the camera. Now, let me introduce you to this evening's guest, Erica Obi, who's returning. She was the first guest in our show back in July. Hard to believe.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Well, you've got another book published, so we're happy to have you. Erica is back with us tonight to discuss her recently published book, Dazzle Paint, and what the last year has been like for her and other writers. It's certainly been a tough one. Erica and I sit on the board of directors of the Mystery Writers of America New York chapter, and it's certainly been challenging working with the group and with writers as we go through it. We went through the last year. As you may recall, Erica is a award-winning author, president of the New York chapter, as I just said. So, Erica, good evening, and welcome back to our podcast. How's it
Again, thank you for having me back. And yes, it has been a crazy year for all of us at MWA and personally.
Could you talk a little bit more about, what it's been like for you? I know you're sitting up on a mountain in upstate New York, self-quarantining during the pandemic. How's that going for you?
I am very reluctant to say this because it sounds so horrible. I guess a little bit of background. We are not terribly young, though we're not terribly old. My husband was sort of thinking of retiring, and we were thinking of dialing back to living in our weekend house at Woodstock full-time for a while. Then he got this crazy high-tech job doing AI financial consulting, 20-year-olds in cargo shorts kind of thing. And their company went virtual about a year and 2 weeks ago. And good. So we got the best of both worlds. We've been up here since then. It's always where we've wanted to be. And you just don't want to say a pandemic has worked out okay for you, but it has worked out okay. I've gotten a fair amount of writing done. Our garden looks great. And we are where we wanted to be, and we always thought it was going to have to be a choice, and it isn't. I hate to say it. I never even like to talk about it because it sounds so horrible to even suggest that.
No, I don't think so. Many of us have had to make accommodations to get by for the last year. And you just took advantage of, what you had available to you. You're doing fine. I wouldn't worry about it. It's maybe the people who jumped out of Manhattan, and took their private jets to some place where they live in their private country clubs. That's something else. But this was your life, and this is the way you planned it. And events just forced you to maybe accelerate things a little. That's all.
On the other hand, there was a point where we had to make an emergency venture down to the city to retrieve summer clothing because I was doing online Pilates in my husband's gym shorts. And I don't have a lot of self-respect, but at a certain point I was like, no, don't laugh at me here. This is horrible.
No, TMI there, Erica. I just don't want to go there.
Exactly.
But I understand your menagerie has grown a little.
We have two kittens named Bubble and Squeak. Yes.
I've seen pictures. They're cute.
Adorable. They are calming down slowly. We have a housekeeper who chased a copperhead out of our house. We wouldn't want to say Woodstock is all sweetness and light. Probably the first week she was actually able to work in the pandemic, she came upstairs and said, "There's a snake downstairs and it's a copperhead." And she just went down and chased it out with a broom. But this is like a woman you don't argue with. So at a certain point, one of the people on her cleaning crew got this call saying you could hear her take it going, "Oh yeah, they're kittens and stuff." And Lainey just marched on over to us and said, "Erica, do you know anybody who'd take two kittens?" And it was like, you don't say no. But they are adorable. They're really adorable.
They are. They are. I've seen pictures, folks, and they're two cute kittens. That's good. That's good. Well, Erica, let's move on and talk about why we brought you back this evening. Your new book, Dazzle Paint. It's out. It's a little bit different than your previous writings. Could you tell us a little bit about it? What was your inspiration, and how did you do the research for it?
Well, I live in an arts colony in Woodstock, New York, which is basically the historical setting for Dazzle Paint. I fictionalized it for a lot of reasons. Woodstock, New York has this reputation for being a countercultural center. On the other hand, anybody who's anybody knows the concert didn't happen here. The concert happened 100 miles away in a different county in Allenville, Yasgur's Farm, Bethel, New York. They took the name of Woodstock because it was already known as a crazy artist colony. It was known that way because of two colonies that were established here, one in 1903, the one I live in, called Bird Cliff, and another one called Maverick, which was probably established in 1911. And these were the colonies. Before that, Woodstock was actually a very conservative farming town. But these were the colonies that established Woodstock as a bad behavior mecca. There is actually a very interesting dichotomy between the two. Birdcliff, where I live, was founded by an incredibly rich couple, Rafe Whitehead, English, and his wife, Jane Bird McCall Whitehead. That's where the name comes from, between their middle names. Made a fortune in steel. This is a very typical arts and crafts story. So then they built this utopian artist colony. One thing you have to get used to with utopian artist colonies with rich people is they will build a main building with servants' wings. But it's a brotherhood of artists, but whatever, servants' wings. They founded it with Hervé White, among others, and people they met at Hull House in Chicago, which was a very progressive settlement school activist group of people who were trying to educate and improve people in tenements. Hervé White, the artist, who was a maverick in his own right, spent about 5 years here and just decided rich men and poor men couldn't be friends. And he went off and founded the Maverick. The main thing I was fascinated about in Dazzle Paint, or the thing I was trying to capture, is Birdcliff had a lot of rich intellectuals, a lot of privileged intellectuals. John Dewey came, and these are people who did a lot of good. John Dewey, Ellen Gates Starr, who was Jane Addams' partner in Hull House, Sarah Teasdale was here, a whole bunch of people. But on the other hand, these people were so bought in to their social situation, starting with the servants' wings, but in a lot of ways, that while you want to respect them for doing a whole lot of good, there's also this question that their class and their preconceptions blind them to these huge things they're just not seeing.
Interesting. Yes, that period in American history is fascinating, where you had these robber barons who made their fortunes in steel, coal, petroleum, railroads, and then towards the end of their lives, decided to become philanthropic. I think Andrew Carnegie may be one of the most well-known people out there, who was ruthless, made his fortune, and then tried to redeem himself. Down here where I live in New Jersey, his name is all over the place, and there's a lot of libraries across the country with a similar claim to fame that he helped get them started way back when.
Yeah, Carnegie, again, he's one of these people. You can't quite figure out how you feel about him, because yes, he was instrumental in putting down horrible strikes, but you sort of got to love a guy. He was not unlike Bill Gates, Carnegie, in that he didn't leave a thing to his kids. Bill Gates, it's interesting because Bill Gates was not going to leave a thing to his kids, and then he was like, I'm going to leave them $1 million each. And then his daughter took up show jumping, and then, all right, and why should he not support her in this, but yeah, it is sort of interesting when these things happen.
Well, I think another, contemporary example for us is, Jeff Bezos. On one hand, he's created Amazon, which, for a while there was, and probably still is, leading edge in terms of technology, but, what cost to local businesses, to workers, to the overall economy and social welfare of the country. Meanwhile, on the flip side, he owns the Washington Post, which, in American politics is probably one of the leading progressive liberal newspapers left in the country. It's an interesting quandary that we see when, we see these people who, on one hand, we may question their business ethics or the value to society, but on the flip side, they do some good.
Well, and I suppose to take it to, if you will, a safer place, because I am very fascinated with the 19th century industrialists and this urge for improvement and self-improvement. And in some ways that seems simpler and more innocent than trying to sort out what's going on up now. But I wrote my dissertation on Lady Charlotte Guest, and honestly, she was sort of the model for the woman in the rich heiress in Dazzle Paint, much more than the actual whiteheads who ran this place, because they've got some problems. But Lady Charlotte Guest married a steelmonger, an iron master, because somebody once tracked me down across the internet to complain about my use of the word ironmonger on my dissertation, my published dissertation. But anyway, she's this woman that founded schools for her husband's workers in the mines and the iron factories. Her husband, who is like this person I adore, yeah, he founded them because he funded them because he just found out, wow, I educate my workforce, I make more money, which is great. You gotta love this guy. And he was actually known, they said, when Sir John Guest spoke in Parliament, someone lost money. I mean, he was one of those dour old Scotsmen, or Yorkshiremen, I guess, exactly. And I was fascinated by Lady Charlotte because Okay, first of all, she had this whole folklore thing going. She translated the Mabinogion from the Welsh because her husband's factories were in Wales. She established schools for the workers, and there is a lovely story where she was on a transatlantic steamer, and a gentleman approached her and said, I was educated in one of your schools, and he'd obviously done very well for himself. And on the other hand, she flounced home once. You've got all her diaries. And she flounced home one night going, some young ladies just don't know how to spell Thessalonica. And so it is this entire tension between cultural appropriation, cultural imposition, and a genuine desire to do well. And as I said, I'm always very sympathetic with her husband, where I was like, I get a better profit if these people know what they're doing and feel there's advancement. But okay, maybe I am a closet utilitarian. Couldn't say so.
Oh, I don't think you're closet about that, Eric. I've known you long enough.
Right.
Well, you're very right about the 19th century. That whole era of self-improvement. We were still in the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Britain, and it was beginning in Europe, and America was coming up fast. You had many organizations that we take for granted now that were set up for self-improvement. The YMCA, the YWCA are just two examples. You had working men's clubs where they would teach reading and writing to people. I should say they would teach reading and writing to men. It was still kind of a misogynistic society back then, or at least more so than it is today, maybe. And we had in the background, we had Marx working on Das Kapital, which kind of led to what happened in the 20th century. So yeah, there was a lot of fermenting of ideas and beliefs at that time. We had this conflict between the haves versus the have-nots. The haves maybe trying to assuage their conscience with setting up schools, art centers, museums, libraries, what have you. And at the other extreme, you had the working class who were prepared to, take what they felt was rightfully theirs by force on the streets if they had to. So this is, I guess, the whole background for Dazzle Paint. Then this tension that was coming out of society. Would that be a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I think I also wanted to talk about things. Well, I'm going to derail you for a moment because when we go with the 19th century, okay, here's my ruthless plug for MWA New York. But one of the crucial, critical things with all this self-improvement that's happening in the 19th century is the advent of A, mass literacy, and B, mass printing,
Yes.
and genre fiction. And this is actually why I adore genre fiction. Don't get me, well, you'll probably get me going on it.
Let's get you going. That's why we got you here.
Yeah, but yes, this starts really about 1820, 1830, and I actually did do an article on this folklorist who published the poems of a woman who worked for her. One thing that was really big in the Romantic era, which let's cap that about 1830, 1840, was this notion of finding native poets, naive vernacular poets. Robert Southey found one. One thing I did write an article on was Anna Bray, and this serving woman named Maria Collins, who was sort of one of these, if you will, hedge poets. And Anna Bray found her poems written in sort of these composition books, drummed up a subscription to get them published, as this voice of the people. Anna Bray being sort of a vicar's daughter and former actress and blah, 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 and a folklorist and a historical novelist, very minor of the 19th century. But, you don't know what to make of the tale of Maria Collings because Bray, her patron, saw her poems published, and Collings had this story about how her grandmother, a Spanish refugee, had taught her to read or write, and when she made money from this subscription, Collings put the money toward a headstone to that grandmother in the Tavistock churchyard, which, when I went on a research trip back in those days, I found, and the vicar hadn't even known what it was, and I was like, that's Maria Collings' headstone. But, so it was this moment of pride and inscription, and it was sort of terrible because all these wealthy people would come to watch Maria Collings recite her poetry whilst she did her household chores, which is just terribly like a trained dog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I see the irony.
Yeah. But she did have this where it gets worse. Do you really want to hear worse or not?
Yes, we do. We do, please.
Oh, okay. At the end, Maria Collings succumbed to this terrible dementia, sort of like Tourette's, where, here's the whole thing. She had control of language. This was the one thing she had. It got her somewhere. She saw it published. She saw it memorialize her grandmother. She saw it published on her own right. So she was given that. And, in the end, she lost it to this dementia, and she was put away. And I told you didn't want to hear it. It's downer, ain't it?
Yeah, well, but it's life. And for our audience out there, in case you haven't been doing your homework, Erica holds a PhD in comparative literature and is taught at the university level in prominent schools in New York City, and is published widely. And
that's why she talks so often and so obscurely. Okay, so
no, you do not talk often, or do not talk obscurely. We're here to educate people. Think of us as the 21st century, what they were doing back in the 19th century, except we got the internet. So, I get the sense of where that Dazzle Paint came from. This where you live. It was your inspiration. How long did it take you to write the book, and how difficult was the research for this one? Because I know you spend a lot of time working on your books before they come anywhere near the public.
This one wasn't terrible. I guess one thing I did want to touch on obliquely and not obliquely was the anti-Semitism of the Catskills, because this is set in about 1919, and there is horrible anti-Semitism in the Catskills at this moment. I'm also very interested in this notion that there are communists here. So I was very interested in those things. I'm going to shut that. We can come back to that conversation. Going back to the research, yes, I live here. Fortunately, I was very lucky. The Woodstock Historical Society, can't give them too many shouts out. I went to their archives, and they have all sorts of fabulous materials. All right, going back to the anti-Semitism, including like these, there were plenty of guest farms up here whose brochures had wonderful things about galvanized cooling systems for water, and also had one of my favorite lines, no tuberculars, no Hebrews. So you get this palpable sense from these artifacts of what this was really like here. Going a little forward, Woodstock is a town with incredibly long roots. And I lived in terror of, writing something and having somebody whose grandmother was here going, oh, no, that's not how it happened. I hired a fact checker, and I'm glad I did. I mean, my first pass of fact checking was going to the Historical Society, where I learned that it probably wouldn't be a really good idea to have them opening a bottle of sherry on the porch of the Teetotal Meads Mountain House. Yeah. But, I Fern Malkine fact-checked everything, and she's got total albums full of postcards. And I'm sure I've still got a billion things wrong. But, I hired a fact checker, and she found 400 things I had wrong after I'd gone to the Historical Society and everything else. Yeah.
Which is only proof that we should never edit or proofread our own work, as some of my friends will attest to my writing. One last question about your book before we start talking about what's happening out there in the world of writing. The name Dazzle Paint, how did that come about for the book?
Because, all right, Dazzle Paint is a form of camouflage, of military camouflage. When they first started, camouflage has been around since Caesar, but naval camouflage, when you're dealing with rowboats or canoes, yeah, you can disguise them as logs. It's a little difficult to disguise a ship.
Yeah.
And the first attempts were to actually disguise the ship by putting trees. I don't know exactly what they did. I do know it was an attempt to hide the ship and put trees up, and there was this incredible amount of stuff they put sort of on the, I don't know what you call it, the masts or whatever, and it never made it out of the harbor before the entire camouflage fell off and they nearly capsized the ship. So Dazzle Paint, on the other hand, it's just an art form in itself as far as I'm concerned. What it does is it paints a ship with jagged lines and angles so that you darn well know you're looking at a ship. It's perfectly, what you're looking at, and yet you can't tell what you see. Because you can't, or to be technical, you can't tell its direction, you can't tell its speed, you can't tell its orientation, because there are too many jagged lines screwing it up. And the thing on the cover of my book is just a small example, beautiful pictures of a PT boat. The PT boat picture is one of my favorites. You just can't tell what you're seeing. Of course, me being my bad, pretentious self, as far as I'm concerned, that is a metaphor for magic, and it's a metaphor for fiction, where you're not lying, you're not telling the truth. You aren't sort of saying, okay, and I'm a postmodernist too, in case you never guessed. You're not saying this is real, this is imaginary. You're saying, I know it's there, I can't tell what I'm seeing. And for me, that's a very, very essential metaphor.
Very good, very good. That's very, very interesting. For folks who
haven't... It's my dissertation talking, I'll shut up now.
Yep. No, you're here to talk. You're here to talk. Trust me, they're not here to listen to me. That's very interesting. And I think everyone who reads the book, if you haven't yet, will find it to be a very telling story and catch Erica's point about the relevancy of the title to the story. Now, moving along, Erica, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what's happening in the world of writing. Given your role as the president of the New York chapter of Mystery Writers of America, what have you seen with the writers that you work with for the last year during the course of the pandemic? I know we've had difficulties because we can no longer have physical meetings. Writers can't go out to bookstores, book clubs, libraries like they used to. How's the writing community pulling through?
I hope, and I don't know how much I have to get into my individual plans as chapter president, I hope this can be an opportunity. I mean, I like the virtual world, that's me, but I really do hope this can be an opportunity to look for hybrid opportunities in various ways for various organizations, various conferences, or whatever. There is sort of I don't want to say cut in stone, but there is a sort of idea like, okay, this is how a conference works. This is how panels at MWA work. We rent this, we go here. And while there's a lot to be said for it, it's also, I do think this virtual thing does open up the possibility of different imaginative opportunities. Talking about MWA New York, which is actually very specific, we are a chapter that encompasses 6 states. All of them, not all of them, but most of them. New York, which is huge in itself, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, I'm sure, West Virginia. And one thing I've sort of thought as chapter president is we've always had monthly meetings in New York City because it's central, but this is very difficult for people from, let's say, Pennsylvania, let alone West Virginia. It's $100 train fare. And so I do think, since we're all Zoom experts anymore, this expertise in Zoom does open up the possibility that we could start having hybrid meetings or distributed meetings or something like that to share across our distributed membership. I mean, that's my very specific personal thing. I think on a larger thing, I don't want to be cynical, but I'm a little cynical. I think that can go larger with even the big conferences like VoucherCon or the Edgars or Sleuthfest or whatever, that actually, right now, I'm a little zoomed out, I admit that. But on the other hand, I think it's opening up the possibility of things you could do rather than just that thing of you rent a hotel, you book a set of rooms, you book a set of panels. And I think that's kind of exciting.
I agree with you. I think the unfortunate, as unfortunate as the pandemic has been, I think that we're going to find that there are going to be advances in this concept of the virtual digital community that are going to happen much more quickly than if we had let them go at their natural pace. One example I'd like to bring up, and you're probably too modest to mention it, is the annual holiday function, which the New York chapter had back in December. Traditionally, before that, it would be held in a really nice bar in Manhattan, but that couldn't happen last year. and you led the team to have the online Rebels, which was a success. We had a large crowd. People stayed for the entire event, and people spoke very well of it. And if I can make a plug for Mystery Writers of America, New York, we still do have that party out there on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. So yeah,
we had a great time, and let's make a plug for Eric Anderson and our online cyber
mixologist,
mixologist. Thank you, Sharon Linnea. Yes, we had fun, and
I get the sense that several of our attendees were mixing their own drinks as we went along that evening. That's all I'm going to say.
Maybe.
That's quite all right. They weren't driving. So yeah, I think that you're right. We're going to see changes. Also, the tools are changing. No longer is it just, broadcasting a signal out to the world, but people are able to charge admission. They're able to have participation. They're able to share documents, screens, bring in videos. So there's a lot that could be done here, and I think we're going to be seeing this. I know the newest member of the board of directors of Mystery Writers of America, New York, Gary Ross, who resides up in Buffalo. And by the way, plug, he's going to be on our show in September. He's been working to develop a program for the Buffalo area, which we're, hoping to be able to stream out to all our members, because it's hard to get people to places like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, West Virginia. And if we can start incorporating the technology, I think we can bring in a lot more people than we have, both writers as well as the fans.
And I'm a game geek, actually. I sort of loved that we had the quizzes at the Rebels, and I, despite my clearly inept navigation of this particular virtual universe, I think there's a lot of room to be had with games and interactive stuff as well. And
yep.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting, the possibility of going forth and playing with it.
Oh yeah, gamification I think will be a big part of virtual events in the future. There are certain things that we miss by not being together, but if you can incorporate a gaming element, there's the opportunity to bring people in, have participation, have people enjoy themselves. So yeah, I think there's a lot that could be done here, and that in a post-pandemic world, and folks, I'm not quite as cynical as Erica. I do believe we're going to get out of this. I don't know when, but we're going to get out of it. But I think a lot of the ideas that we're kicking around now are going to stay with us for a long, long time, and they're going to be developed. Just like the Black Death in Europe in the 15th century caused a lot of changes that accelerated the development of Europe and the Western world to where it is today. I think we're going to see, we're going to look back in 100 years and see this period of time is kind of like the Great Divide in the digital world, where we kind of went from the early pre-industrial days to a more industrial or even post-industrial model.
I would agree with you. I think there's an incredibly opportunity out there, and I can't say I'm not a cyberhead. I am a cyberhead. I'm married to an AI programmer in cybersecurity.
Oh, you're a cyberhead, Burke. I've been around you long enough. You are.
But I do think, yeah, it's fun to sort of play with this.
Yeah. Well, I think the key word there is play.
Something very interesting can open up.
Yep. Well, I think you're right. Let's talk a little bit more about the writers themselves, if I may. One, the full-time writer, the person who made their living just by their writing, whether it was books, articles, short stories, seems to be becoming extinct. And if you disagree with me, please smack me. What do you think? It seems that the publishers, now that we're down to the big four, seem to only support the megastars, the James Pattersons, the Stephen Kings, the J.K. Rowlings. Everybody else is kind of like out there on their own. We're seeing people self-publish. We're seeing people do independent publishing. Do you think the full-time successful writer is a thing of the past, or will there continue to be a venue for that type of person?
I think the full-time success, all right, now I'm like, is oxymoron a contradiction in terms? Full-time successful writer, I think, has always been a contradiction in terms.
Okay.
If you are measuring somebody being a successful writer by them being able to live off their publications, okay, that's fair. And that is a standard to which MWA subscribes. And don't get me in trouble here, it is not a standard I am very happy with. There has never, the great writers have rarely made money off their writing. The great successful ones, I'm trying to go back. Okay, Shakespeare, I'll give you. But Earl of Rochester, Homer, maybe I'll give you. But somebody like the Earl of Rochester, Byron, even Shelley to a degree, these are people with family fortunes. Yes, they're successful writers. And I like a commercial writer. I think you play tennis with a net. You measure your success in terms of commerce. But I do think this notion that you're earning your living by your writing is unduly constraining. Virginia Woolf, not a family fortune behind her. You know, I know I'm sounding very iffy on this whole thing, but I do believe you play tennis with a net. You measure the value of your book in your readership. I have a huge asterisk with that, but I'll say, in case I've said tennis with a net too many times, this is what Robert Frost once said about poetry. It's like playing tennis with a net. You could just tell yourself, I'm writing a heartbreaking work of staggering genius all the time. The way you test that is going out there and seeing how many people agree. So I do believe you need to go doing that. On the other hand, the measure of your success or the value of your writing being the number of people who read your books, or more importantly, the money you make, I think that's an incredibly false standard. That's the best way I can put it.
Okay. Let me ask you another. I'd like your opinion on something. We're going through the great pandemic of 2020, now 2021. Some people are saying that this is probably the most disruptive event in world history since the Second World War. I know a couple of people who would say that about the Beatles, but we won't go there. One thing that I've noticed, and I consider myself a reasonably well-read person, not nearly as well-read as you or many of the other people we know in the chapter, but it wasn't until my late teens that I became aware of the great influenza pandemic of 1918. And there haven't been too many books or mentions in the records that I came across that talked about it until recently. And I've also noticed as I got older and I read more fiction that while people talk about World War I, Great Depression, the Roaring '20s, even the Spanish-American War, The great influenza of 1918 has kind of been omitted from the collective memory, even in fiction. Do you think we'll have the same occurrence with the great pandemic of 2020? Are we going to start seeing it appear in fiction, mysteries, and thrillers in particular in the next few years, or are we just going to suppress it and pretend it's not here?
I think those are two separate questions. To begin with, I think one reason I am very fascinated with the period about 1915 to 1922 is that the Great War, as far as I'm concerned, it was one of the most brutal, senseless, pointless wars in European history, and I think it launched an incredible cynicism, as well it might. And I think following on its heel, the great pandemic, which I've always been very aware of, ditto. And I do see very much an echo in that period of what's going on here. And being a historical novelist, that's a much safer place for me to discuss it. To talk about, as a working writer, the nuts and bolts about including the pandemic, I mean, that's a very technical issue for writers, because when you include the pandemic, you date it. And, there's a lot of discussion among writers about updating books from the 80s, like, well, if they had a cell phone, this wouldn't be a problem. And actually, the weirdest thing is the thing that can most date a manuscript is the latest technology. So I think I personally, right now, I'm writing very fizzy escapist stuff because I just don't want to be here. But I think there's a more critical question, which is when you set your book in the pandemic, it mires it in a certain place and time. If you want to write a pandemic book, I'd suggest go back and set it in 1918. Don't set it now. And that is a weird thing. I know this has been a discussion on a lot of message boards among writers, like, do you mention the pandemic or don't you? Because when you do, you're setting it, you're tying it very much to a specific place and time.
I see. Interesting. Yeah, you make a good point. The question about technology in particular, I've heard that one for years now. How many great plots would have been unraveled because we now have a cell phone and can call for the police. So, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how writers address this, as you said. Do they just go back 100 years or skip around it? But for sure, it'll be good. Next question for you, Erica, is besides your research for your books, what have you been reading during the pandemic?
Well, I'm not allowed to answer that because I'm judging a certain contest. But
I'm sorry. I hadn't realized that. How about?
I am reading bloody escapist fiction. It started with Phyllis A. Whitney, Mary Stewart, the big Gothic girls.
Mm-hmm. I read her when I was younger.
John Dixon Carr is still like lifeblood to me. Mm-hmm. Terry Pratchett, I'm reading the entire canon at this point, and P.G. Wodehouse, and I just discovered I have been reading back through, okay, shameless self-plug, I am working on this new series about a female programmer and the AI bot she is programmed to write classic murder mysteries. And he's, of course, an obnoxious jerk, but, and it's sort of a small town cozy mystery. But I've been working on what I call Doyle's database, which is all the books that she would have loaded into him to come up with his plots. So I've been spending a lot of time reading crazy classic mystery novels, including those by a guy named John Rode that I am in love with, although, spoiler alert, everyone, just cover your ears if you don't want to know this, there is one of his books that I can't find anything else about other than how it was done, which was, it was a hedgehog dyed green to resemble a plant and poisoned. No, a poisoned hedgehog dyed green to disguise itself as a plant. But yeah, I've been reading a lot of these very, very classic locked room mystery things, ostensibly for Doyle's database, but they're fun. They're escapist. They're quiet.
Cool.
They're long. They're charming.
No, I think these days everybody needs a little escapism, whether it's the classic mysteries, which you seem to have come across, or just urban fantasy, or maybe going back and rediscovering some of the true classics, Tolstoy, Dickens, and the like. But yeah, I think we all need something these days to kind of get our minds off of what's been happening around here. Since you've got your latest book out, and a question I ask writers and I talk to reviewers about, how difficult is it for writers today to get quality reviews for their books?
I don't know. I've done okay. I think it probably depends on your publisher. And I publish with an indie press, but they do get the ARCs out on time. I have gotten quality reviews, and I've also published with presses where they haven't. Yeah, I'm a little iffy about getting into the Amazon wars and stuff like that. I mean, I'm very concierge-y and hands-on about my own social media. I think maybe that is one of the, if there's one of these questions, you're not doing Big Five, you're not doing indie. You're not self-publishing. I think that probably is one of your best judges if you are going to work with small press, because I've worked on both ends of the spectrum, is, are they getting your books to quality reviewers, and are they getting the reviews? Ditto, are they getting your books to quality contests? I'd probably say if you're, because it's a little wild out there. I would advise writers, if you're trying to make this decision, that would probably be a benchmark I would look at, is, are they doing this for you?
I see.
Probably a very important benchmark.
I see. Yeah, I think, as we start to wrap up our discussion for tonight, we're going to find that publishing has always been a difficult world for the writer. The tools are changing, the business structures are changing, the environment, thanks to the pandemic itself around us, is changing, and that going forward for writers, it's going to be, probably as difficult, maybe a little bit more difficult, but, adaptation is going to be the key to surviving as a writer in the future.
All right, I'm going to be contrarian and say,
Please.
I see a lot of stuff opening up. And, all right, I'm sounding very sullen about this and defensive and everything else.
Go right ahead.
And this gets back to your question. If you've got this idea that the success of a writer is, that they're making a living from selling their books, and you're going to be a good little girl and try to get an agent and go to a big 5 publishing thing, well, that world is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And I don't mean it to be sour grapes, and I still want to earn $1 million one day. But I also think at a certain point, it's like, who needs this? And there is an incredible eruption of possibilities out there for people who are trying to do very different things. And yeah, it is a little Wild West. You have to judge among these indie publishers. You've got to judge among self-publishing. I mean, again, I've been with an indie publisher I'll never go back to. I've been with one I'm working on my 4th book with, talented person. I tend to think this can be the moment where we're like, you got a manuscript and you start going, so I've got to convince an agent on flavor of the month, and then they have to convince whoever they convince on flavor of the month. And I do think something's opening up there, and I'm one of the last people to believe this. On the other hand, Cassandra Clare with all her little angel people, Angel Teens, huge bestseller. That was fan fiction, I believe. Twilight was fan fiction. Shack was self-published. A lot of these things were writers who went out there and said, this is my vision for the book. I'm getting it out there. And then I am going to work on marketing it. And I do actually think optimistically, yes, things are closing down maybe for trad publishing, and I'm not sure that's a really bad thing because a lot of things are opening up on another side.
That's very good. I'm glad we're ending on a hopeful note here then, Erica, that, despite the changes, there are possibilities. And, one chapter closes and another one opens up. How about we just see if we have any questions out there in the audience before we get started? I know we have a few people in the audience, and in case anybody has sent any in, just want to check. If anybody has any questions, now's your chance. Okay, guess not. Well, maybe we'll get them on the video when it goes up. Okay, so Erica, I'd like to thank you for coming in again. It was really great to have you back, talk about your book, Dazzle Paint, to get your theories on writing, what's happening out there. I'm sure it's going to be very encouraging for many people who listen to our show. I hope to see you again in the future when you have your next book out.
Oh, I think I'll see you before that, but yes.
Yeah, true. Yes, true.
Thank you for having me.
I'm not actually seeing me next week, but that's another story. But at least here on the show. So, right now, I just want to say to the audience, thank you all for joining us for this week's episode. Just tell your friends if they missed it that we'll be out on YouTube, on our channel. They can find it. Please come back next month. Our guest is going to be the New York Times best-selling writer, James Heyman. Who'll be here talking about his life as a writer, and it's a very interesting one. So we'll end the live broadcast now. Please contact me at Con Sweeney at someti.com if you have any suggestions for panelists, ideas for shows, or wish to participate yourself in the future. As I do this, I'm learning that putting on a show like this isn't easy. So if you'd like to volunteer to help out on our stage group, please let me know. We'd be glad to have you. We're working on the guest list for the rest of the year. Like I said, we have James coming on next month. I mentioned we got Gary Ross coming in September. We're completing the summer now, and we should have the rest of the year filled out. So we've got a pretty good portfolio of guests coming up. So thank you all for joining, and see you again next month. Stay safe. Take care, everyone.